My name is Rachel. I'm the digital marketing manager at Bat Conservation International. So I do our social media. So if you're ever interacting on our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, etc., it's probably me that you're talking to. And I'm super excited today because as it's getting a little bit chillier outside, even snowing in some parts of the country, we're going to talk about hibernating bats, which is kind of like a mystery, at least in my mind. So Dr. Tina Chang is here, and she's going to tell us a little bit about like bat hibernation ecology and kind of what we do at BCI when bats are hibernating. So if you are on Zoom, feel free to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And if you're on Facebook, feel free to ask questions in the Facebook comment section, and we will answer those at the end of the session. So Tina, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Let me just get myself oriented here. Do the necessary clicking. Oh, am I sharing the right screen? I feel like I didn't do that right.
You're sharing everything, yeah. All of your life.
You don't need to see my Googling. Yeah, let's try that again. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And like Rachel said, it is getting chilly outside. I'm over here on the West Coast in Oregon, but it snowed here last week. So even out here on the West Coast, we get some chilly weather. But I know in a lot of other parts of the US, North America, maybe where you are at, you're getting some significant winter weather. And, so we're here really today to talk about, like not what we do. I turn on my heater, but what do bats do in the winter? So they're really faced with like two options. They can either hightail it out of here and migrate, or they can hunker down, find a spot and hibernate. And it turns out that of the 45 bat species here in the US, over half of them actually choose not to book it down south, but to stick around and tough it out and hibernate. To do that, they actually have to seek out really special habitats. So usually underground in places like caves and mines, where temperatures are relatively stable over the winter, where there's high humidity, so they don't have to worry about drying out. Now, these places are cold, it kind of feels like walking into a fridge, but even though it's cold, it's still way warmer than above ground where temperatures can be freezing and below zero. And as mammals, we can't really handle freezing temperatures that well because we ourselves will literally freeze. So if any of you have ever, been inside a walk-in fridge, or even if you're just walking outside right now in the winter, you'll start to shiver, right? Because we have to keep our body temperatures really warm as mammals. That requires a lot of work and a lot of energy, and it's not very pleasant. So bats, when they go into hibernation, they choose not to fight that energetic cost. They actually bring their body temperatures all the way down close to the ambient temperature of the cave, which can be like 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. Their heartbeats also drop way down. They essentially shut down their body. So they're not really doing much at all. They're just trying to subsist for the duration of the winter. Now, this doesn't mean that they stay in this state. We call it torpor. It doesn't mean that they stay in that state of torpor for the entire length of winter. They do need to arouse from torpor, and they do this roughly every 3 to 4 weeks. And we don't exactly know why they do it, but we think that there's a lot of metabolic costs of staying in torpor. So we believe that they do need to arouse and excrete waste, maybe drink a little bit of water before they go back into torpor for some duration of time. Now, during torpor, they actually save a ton of energy. It's those arousals that are actually really energetically costly. They have to go from those really low temperatures, about 4 or 5 C, all the way up to like normal mammal body temperature around 32 Celsius. So that takes a lot of energy. So they're burning through a ton of fat just to arouse every time. So to survive winter, bats actually have to put on a lot of fat, like gain a lot of weight. And roughly speaking, it's about 30% increase in their body weight that they gain during the fall, right before they go into winter. So this winter hibernation period is actually also a great time for us biologists to observe these animals that are often really cryptic, that we don't see because they're active in the evenings and they're small. So, like other animals, we don't have a chance to observe them very commonly. However, in some locations in the US, you can go into these subterranean environments in the winter and you might encounter hibernating bats. And as biologists, this is a great opportunity for us to actually come in and monitor these populations. When I say monitor, I literally mean like Count Von Count from Sesame Street. We go and we count the bats on the ceiling. Now, this is a endeavor that takes place at sites all across the US, even in Canada. We have partners in Canada, and it's part of a larger program called the North American Bat Monitoring Program that we at BCI work really closely with to help make sure that we can get these surveys in every year. So I'm going to walk you through what this information looks like. So this is real data from a site in Virginia. It's a cave in the Appalachian Mountains. And these are real counts of the little brown bat, Myotis lucificus. And you can see that there, back in 2005, we visited the cave. A couple years later, 2007, 2009, and their populations were about roughly somewhere around 16 to 1,700 bats at that cave. And then something pretty dramatic happens. So those populations look like they were pretty stable up until about 2009. And then there was a precipitous drop where that population pretty much became completely extirpated. So the reason for this is a disease called white nose syndrome. It's caused by a fungus that invades the skin of hibernating bats. And it often appears as fuzzy white growth around their muzzles. So as you can see in this hibernating bat here, all of that white stuff that looks like flocking on a Christmas tree is actually the fungal pathogen growing on the skin of the bat. Now, we had talked about just previously how bats, when they hibernate, actually essentially shut their bodies down, which means that even things like their immune system is not really functioning. So they're incredibly vulnerable to pathogens at this point in time. It turns out that this is an invasive fungal pathogen, we believe likely brought by humans to North American bats who are naive to this pathogen. And so it is particularly destructive and lethal for some species of hibernating bats. Specifically, we know that these three species have been hit really hard by white nose syndrome. This is the northern long-eared bat, the tricolored bat, and the little brown bat. So white nose syndrome, we believe, first arrived to the US in about 2006 and has since spread through most of the continental US and up into Canada. Here you'll see for each of these bats, the range of the species in that black shaded area. And where you see the red is where WNS has been confirmed in each of these species. And those percentages here, 79% for northern long-eared bat, 60% for tricolored bats, and 36% for little brown bats, represents what proportion of that species range is affected by white nose syndrome. Now, if you look a little bit even more closely, you'll see a little yellow dots on top of those that red shaded polygon. Those are places where we are monitoring bat populations of those species and tracking them, tracking how they're doing over time, and especially interested in what's happening to those populations as white nose syndrome hits each of those sites and each of those populations. So this animation that I'm showing you right now, starting in 2000, is actually showing you those sites of northern long-eared bats where the size of the point is relative to the size of the population. And what you see here spreading right now is the disease wave of white nose syndrome, starting in upper state New York in 2006 and spreading throughout the continent, and still spreading actually currently every winter. You'll notice that as the disease spreads, those circles are getting smaller, indicating that those populations are declining, in many cases, completely disappearing. So extirpating those bats at those sites, going to zero. This is that same animation, but for tricolor bats. You can see that tricolor bats are a little bit more populous down in the south, right? They do extend into the northern range as well. And again, as white nose syndrome comes through, you see those circles getting smaller and smaller, representing population decline, and to be a little bit more direct, bat mortality. And for the little brown bat, the story is very similar. Now, little brown bats can have populations into the tens of thousands. So prior to white nose syndrome, those were those really big circles in the Northeast. And sadly, you can see that as white nose syndrome spreads, those populations just get decimated. So if we were to add up those numbers and give an estimate for how much decline we're seeing on average for each of these species, these are what those numbers would be in red on the bottom of the screen. So we see that when white nose syndrome hits northern long-eared bats, that they are almost always just completely wiped out. It hits those populations extremely hard. Tricolor bats are also very hard hit, with 93% population declines on average. And little brown bats, severe declines, 98%. And if you can imagine some of those original sites of tens of thousands of bats, if you can imagine the mass mortality event of that many bats being hit by a disease, it is extremely devastating to experience. So BCI was involved in not only the collection of these data, but in the assessment and the analysis of these data too. So we help provide actually those numbers, and it's in a publication. If anyone's interested, I can share that after this presentation. And this assessment was actually used by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine whether or not these species should be listed and protected under the Endangered Species Act. Just this past year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, using in part this information, proposed that both the northern long-eared bat and tricolor bat should be listed as endangered species, which means that they are concerned that these species may actually go extinct. The little brown bat, which we saw also suffered like really severe impacts, is still under review. So what next? I know that oftentimes we go through this sort of doom and gloom discussion about white nose syndrome, death and disease, and it's hard to see where is perhaps the bright end of the rainbow to this story. Well, there's a couple things that we're working on that we're hopeful will not only help in this monitoring, assessment, and protection of affected bat species, but that will actually also help restore populations that are able to persist through this disease wave. So we are working with the North American Bat Monitoring Program to continue doing that really important monitoring every winter. But we're also working with a lot of partners across the US to set up what we're calling bug buffets for bats. So this is a short-term sort of test for a longer-term solution that we're hoping involves habitat restoration. But essentially the idea is to get bats to help them increase the amount of fat that they have going into winter and also coming out of winter, so that they have a better chance of surviving both the effects of the disease as well as those physiological hurdles that they have to go through for hibernation and reproduction every year. So in this picture here is a station that we've set up in Michigan, Upper Michigan, and this is a UV light that we've used to attract insects. And we're finding that bats are using these bug buffets. We're setting them outside hibernacula, and they actually are using them to forage. So this is just an initial first step. And like I said, hopefully in the long term, this will reflect more on doing some habitat restoration in that area to not only bring up insect numbers, but also to help those bats have better body condition. Okay, and so that was my short and sweet presentation. Thank you all for your attention, and would love to take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tina. And I just want to let you know too, we're seeing a couple of the comments from Facebook. People are very impacted by those map animations and how quickly this is all happening. And so I think it's great that people are seeing that this is such important work. And so yes, questions. Thank you everybody for putting questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I guess the first question we'll go with is, how do you distinguish between daily torpor and hibernation?
So during winter, bats will go into torpor for more than just the duration of the day. They, for like 3-4 weeks, even longer periods of time. Daily torpor is something that bats also do, but not during the winter. So they might do that in the summer or even shoulder seasons, where they'll like decrease, turn down some of those body functions, but not completely.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. Thank you. And somebody, Heather on Facebook, is asking, what can a non-professional volunteer like myself do to try and keep bat populations safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that question a lot, and we are trying to find ways to help the public get involved. But a lot of the stuff is somewhat indirect at this point. So it's supporting efforts by conservation scientists like us at BCI to do things like try this bug buffet. We are hoping to get a citizen science program off the ground in the next few years. That's something that would be, very helpful in the long term. I know that there was another Facebook Live discussion by Erin Cord, who's a BCI staff member here, and she works with the public to create bat gardens. So planting plants in your garden that encourage like the type of insects that bats like to forage on. So those are a few things that, that we have, that we offer people as, things that you might be able to do. But Rachel, you might have some more suggestions.
On that note too, I do just want to let everybody know that yes, there was a bat chat webinar just like this a couple weeks ago. And so that was a great one, talking about the bat garden program and how you can specifically support your native bats through planting native plants and offering kind of some habitat improvement. So check that out. It's on our Facebook. It's also on our YouTube, where this will be as well. And we do have more information on that, including a bat gardening guide. And that's on our website at batcon.org/garden. So that's a great way. And I would say, the other thing, Heather, is that when we're talking about supporting bats, it really does help to share the message, telling your friends, telling your social networks, that this is happening. And anybody who is maybe in a position to support BCI's work, we always welcome that. Even if you wanted to start a fundraiser on behalf of BCI on like Facebook or something, that's always something that we're happy to help with. So those are some other options too, but just, telling people about bats and why they're so important is never a wrong way to go.
Yeah, I'll add on to that, Rachel. The sharing and caring component is so huge. Bats get a bad rap in the public eye a lot of the times. And, you know, especially in these recent times, I think there's perhaps some negative public perception about bats. And a lot of bats share space with people in their homes. So they occupy people's attics and aren't always welcome there. So finding ways to coexist with bats, also to, you know, spread the message about how important bats are, and to also let people know that bats themselves are under immense pressure and threat from a disease that humans have brought to North America that are, you know, may cause 2 species to go extinct. So yeah, getting that sort of level of caring out there for bats as well is something that is, I mean, like, really important work.
Yeah. Yeah. We had a very specific question from Emily here on Zoom. She said those maps are amazing. Is there a link to those maps or a publication that I could share?
Yes, there is. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually put those out somewhere. I have to figure out where they are, and I will figure out how to share that link through
Emily.
Rachel.
Yeah, Emily, maybe you can put a comment on Facebook, or you can email us. Email me at social@batcon.org, and we can get those for you. But I agree. I want those too. I want to share those on our social media. So yeah. You'll see them again.
There's nothing like actually seeing it to drive home the impact of the story. Yeah.
And this is a very specific question from Katie on Facebook. So I'm not sure if you'll know this one, but specifically asking about in Ontario, Canada, is there any monitoring going on in the Lake Simcoe region? Because I guess they have northern long-eared bats there. And I know that might not be what BCI is where we're doing work.
Oh, not me personally, but we actually, through the North American Bat Monitoring Program, we have partners in Canada as well. So I'm in touch with the main bat specialist up in Canada, who would probably know more about that specific region. So I need to check in with them, but yes, for sure, northern long-eared bats up in Canada would be very interested to monitor those populations, know if white nose is there and how those populations are doing.
Yeah. And maybe you can talk a little bit more. This is a different Heather on Facebook. How exactly does WNS hurt or kill the bats?
Oh yes, that's such a great question. So we talked about how the fungus invades their skin tissue, and that actually, their skin is a really important organ for doing all kinds of things. Like they actually pass oxygen through their skin, and it's also really important for preventing dehydration of their body. So there's a lot of physiological function of the skin that's disrupted when the pathogen goes in there and invades the skin tissue cells. It causes a cascade of this physiological disruption. So we see that when they take all the vitals on bats that are sick, that their vitals are not good. Like they're not like normal healthy bats. But in addition to that, the other thing that we see is, I mentioned that a normal healthy bat will arouse like every 3 to 4 weeks. We see that with bats that are affected by white nose syndrome, that they arouse much more frequently. Like they'll arouse like every other day. And if you can imagine how much energy they're expending by waking up every couple days, what happens is that they burn through their fat reserves and they simply don't make it through winter. So we often see bats flying out onto the landscape in the middle of winter that are affected by white nose syndrome, or moving to the front of the cave. So they're obviously disturbed and disrupted by the fungal pathogen. It's causing them to wake up more frequently. They're also, in addition to having the physiological disruption in their body, they're also literally starving to death. So this is why things like the Fat Bat Project is really focusing on trying to improve their body condition. There is evidence that there are some populations that are persisting in the Northeast, and that those bats are 2 grams fatter than the bats prior to the arrival of white nose syndrome. So it may be that those bats have learned to actually get way fatter so that they can survive both winter and white nose syndrome.
That's very interesting. And I do want to add a little caveat here, and maybe you can add on to this as well, Tina, because we have a couple questions talking about like, oh, well, does landscape lighting attract like bugs and create a bug buffet? And, you know, I kind of just want to say too, in our last bat chat about the bat gardens, is that, you know, light pollution can actually be detrimental to bats. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a good idea to try to create your own bug buffet. But Tina, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yes, thank you for that question, because there's a really important distinction on what type of lights we use for these bug buffets versus what's often used to like light streets, etc. And UV lights in particular are really good for attracting insects. And these are, you know, small areas that are targeted near bat habitat that we're using these. So for sure, there are lights that, particularly, you know, a lot of these lights that light up our streets that don't attract insects, but that also deter bats and can have detrimental impacts to where bats forage and their migration patterns. So there's an incredible amount of work done by a professor named Jesse Barber, who has done a lot on both light and noise pollution and its effects on bats and bat activity. So yeah, long story short, I would agree with Rachel that setting up a light in your own house, right now, at least, like, we wouldn't recommend it. But I think in the end, we would love to partner with things like the bat gardens, because the end goal really is to encourage like an increase in the density of bat-friendly insects, particularly in the face of the insect apocalypse that has been happening over the past half of the century.
Yeah. And again, if you want to check out that Bat Garden webinar, it is recorded on Facebook and it's on our YouTube. And that does talk about planting plants that attract moths in particular. So if you want to attract bugs, there's other ways to do it besides those lights, which can deter bats. I want to get over here to an interesting question from Felix on Zoom. The small percentage of tricolored bats and little brown bats that didn't die when exposed to white nose syndrome, do we know the reason for that resistance?
So there are multiple different potential reasons for that. And all of those reasons, scientists have found some level of support. So it's likely there's not just a single mechanism that explains survival and persistence, but it may be multiple or a combination of reasons. So there's potential that they have acquired immunity to the fungal pathogen. It's also possible that they are tolerating the disease. So there's no immune response. They're still getting the disease and it's still like infecting their skin tissue, but they have learned ways to tolerate it. And the fat bat, we call it the fat bat hypothesis, is one of those mechanisms that would allow bats to tolerate having the disease. So they would still, experience those increased arousals, but because they have so much more fat, they can still survive through winter. Bats also are very particular about where in the cave they will hibernate. And it turns out that the fungus doesn't grow well in all places. It's also somewhat particular. So there's a Goldilocks situation going on here. So bats, there's some evidence too that there are some bats that are selecting places where perhaps the fungus is just not growing as well on them, and where they also, the temperature and humidity of that specific part of the cave that they chose to hibernate in is also helping them to not arouse as frequently, even if they do get a little bit of the fungus and fungal invasion. So those are some of the ongoing hypotheses. And like I said, there's evidence that all of those hypotheses have some support. But yeah, it is actually a little glimmer of hope that even though there has been such huge population declines, that there are some bats, some individuals, and some populations that are persisting.
That just brings so many other questions to mind. I'm so grateful to all of the bat biologists who are out there trying to, understand this better and answer these questions. Um, and kind of on the same note too, talking about how everything's connected, somebody's asking Nita on Facebook about the impact of insecticides on bats' body weight. And does that make them more vulnerable to white nose syndrome? Do we know if that has an impact? And is there maybe should we be trying to eliminate insecticide use or reduce insecticide use?
Oh, wow. What a great question. To my knowledge, I don't know of any study that has actually looked at that. That would be an excellent research project. I will say that part of the potential impact to bat populations is likely the insect apocalypse, which, one of the hypotheses for why insects have suffers such huge declines is because of the widespread use of insecticides. So, that's a direct impact on bats, but for sure, I think that your question about that indirect linkage between insecticides, bats consuming them, and then it affecting their body condition is, yeah, that's a very interesting question.
And then I'm going to go ahead and just do one more here, and it's on Zoom, about how do we know when bats start hibernating? Is there a definitive start, or?
That is such a great question. I feel like you work with us because just 2 days ago, I was analyzing data that was trying to answer that specific question. The short answer is that we don't know. But there are species experts out there, people who have been monitoring these sites for like 20 years for their entire career. So this is like kind of in their backyard. They like know these sites, they know these bats. So we do have some data where we've asked these experts about when they think bats go in and when they come out of hibernation. So there is a publication, I could share it with you if you're interested, that actually does show that different species go in at different times, and that is also related to latitude. So how far south or north you are. The current project that we're doing actually puts acoustic detectors outside a hibernacula. So those acoustic detectors can actually detect the species, and each individual that comes out will give a signal. So we have a little relative number as well of how many bats are coming out of that cave. So we can look at that over time. And what I was just looking at the other day is that, like, you'll see, let's say November 11th, there's a ton of activity at this cave entrance, and it peaks right here. So that gives us a really good idea that probably bats are starting to come in, let's say November 1st, and that by November 20th, we don't see activity anymore. So that would be a good estimate for when those bats are going into hibernation. But like I said, it varies by species and it varies by space.
I love how it's like such a simple question, and we're like, we don't know. They're just doing their batty thing. It's hard to tell.
Well, I'll say roughly that in the East Coast, it's around November, but in Texas, it's December.
Makes sense, right? That's like, I feel like I would be the same way. It's all about like sunlight, cold.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to thank everybody who showed up. There are more questions, and we just don't have time to get to them all. I do see a couple of them are about bat gardens, bat houses. So I do again want to promote the former bat chats that we've had. Those might help answer your questions. In addition, we do have resources on gardens, on bat boxes at batcon.org. And this is technically not public knowledge yet, but I will tell you guys, since you showed up, that we're going to be doing the next bat chat in January, and that will be on bat houses, bat boxes. So we know that that's a hot topic you guys are interested in. So we're going to be sharing that one in January. If you want to make sure you don't miss it, please be sure to follow our social media accounts, same place that you saw this publicized is the same place that we will publicize the other ones. So it could be Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok. We do also have emails. We send out about 1 email a month. So if you're interested instead in getting that to your email, you can sign up for our email list, which you can do at batcon.org. And it does also seem like people are very interested in this topic, Tina, and are interested in some of those publications that you were talking about. So if you're able to find some of those links, perhaps you can send them to me. I can post them in the Facebook comments here. And if you have any other questions, you can put them in our Facebook comments or reach out to me directly. My email is social@batcon.org. So I do just want to thank everybody again. And Tina, any final thoughts?
Thank you all for joining in today.
Yes, don't hibernate too hard out there, everybody. We know it's cold. Get outside, you could do it. All right, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye.